Hello, and once again, welcome to another jammed pack episode of the Paperback Warrior podcast. My name is Eric. I'm going to take you through a vintage paperback and pulp wonderland today that smoothly connects up with the paperbackwarrior.com blog. We've got thousands of reviews, analysis on fiction, graphic novels, pulps, and the occasional nonfiction book about our favorite subject here, which is books. Be sure to follow us on X, Facebook, also on YouTube, where I'm trying to post a few videos every month, and you can listen to this show and the 100 episodes before it on any streaming app, or play them at paperbackwarrior.com. Today's episode is going to center around a comprehensive and explosive feature on one of the most polarizing spy fiction and mystery writers of all time. The author is Sidney Horler. Chances are you haven't read his stuff, or maybe you didn't even know he even existed. But he was one of the most prolific writers of the early to mid-20th century, cracking out over 150 novels and more than 10 series titles. He also semi-infiltrated London's criminal underground in the 1930s. He waged a headline war with some of his contemporaries, and this dude made a ton of money. I'm also going to review a 1984 paperback novel called Foul Shot. It's a private detective novel written by Doug Hornig. But I've got a few other things thrown in here as well, including pitching ideas to a Hollywood blockbuster producer. That's right, I'm in the big time. Some really wild stuff happening, and I'm excited to talk about all of it. But before all of that, I'm going to compare deer hunting with book hunting. So listen, I grew up in southwestern Virginia, and the first day of rifle season to hunt deer literally would close school. They couldn't keep kids in the schools. Even the teachers were hunting. And even I did my fair share of hunting. But by the time I got in my 20s, I just didn't feel comfortable killing anything. In fact, it kind of depressed me knowing that I did it in the first place. But I would still go out year after year, but I would just take photos of animals. Taking a photo, just saying, hey, I was there, took this photo. Anyway, book shopping has become kind of like that for me now. I've mostly stopped buying books until I can read what I've got, and then book shopping is turned into mostly just taking pictures of books like everywhere I go, and I get the same amount of enjoyment taking a photo of a book and then posting it or even talking about it here. So saying that, I wanted to bring up my recent shopping/photography trip to a place called Second and Charles. This is a chain of bookstores that also specialize in comics, toys, records, movies, clothing, and just your average pop culture stuff. We've got a large Second and Charles store in Jacksonville. Honestly, if my city didn't already have the best bookstores on the East Coast in Chamberlain's Book Mine, then this Second and Charles store would be maybe a frequent place I'd go, but because of all the other stores in the area, I go to Second and Charles about 4 times per year, just to see if they have any new vintage stuff and to buy a few things before Tom Simon can get there. But he hates Second and Charles, so there's probably no competition between the two of us. So my wife and I, we stopped in there recently just to kill some time before hitting a nearby restaurant. The first thing I saw on the shelves was a book called Dominion by Fred Saberhagen. This is a Tor paperback in his Dracula series. I don't see these out very much. I found an old Dahl paperback in the Gore saga, or the Counter-Earth saga, whatever you want to call it. I saw a book called On the Shoulders of Giants, which looks like a Viking or fantasy novel in a series called Dream Quest. It was published in the late 1980s by Signet. The author is Lloyd St. Alcorn, but that's really David N. Meyer. I found a series I wasn't aware of, men's action adventure, or maybe you want to call it military fiction, just simply called Navy SEALs by a guy named Mike Murray. I'm not sure if that's his name or pseudonym. It wouldn't surprise me if it's written by someone like Mike Newton or Mark Roberts. This book was the second installment called Green Solitaire. There's a stack of 9 Stony Man paperbacks. There was a hardcover edition of Alistair MacLean's River of Death. Not a great book, but a cool edition of it. Someone unloaded their entire James A. Michener collection because there's a shelf there featuring like 20 of his books in hardcover, paperback. They are stacked in there, some as low as $1. There was a vintage Dell paperback of Elmore Leonard's The Moonshine War, which has a beautiful painted cover. There was also Lauren Estelman's General Murders paperback. That's a Fawcett Gold Medal release featuring 10 Amos Walker short stories. I like that author and I like that character. There was a vintage Dell paperback with a great aviation painted style cover called The Fight of the Few by Richard Hoe. It looked great. There was a vintage paperback from Berkeley called Shadows, which is an anthology of various horror stories written by guys like Stephen King. He's always in these anthologies. There were 10 shelves between two cabinets that featured nothing but Clive Cussler. We see his books everywhere. This shelf had about 8 to 10 Cussler books and various series titles. There's 10, like I said, there's 10 shelves, two huge cabinets. So there's probably well over 100 Clive Cussler books there for the taking. There was War the Ninja Master #2, the Shibo Discipline, on Warner Books from the 1980s. Some of your old-timers out there, like myself, may remember the old Mork and Mindy series. I think it was on ABC, if I'm not mistaken. The book I found is from Pocket Books, and it's a Mork and Mindy novel written by Ralph Church based on a TV show. I don't know if it's based on an episode that aired or if it's just an original. I've never seen a Mork and Mindy book out and about. There were 3 Gold Eagle paperbacks in the Outlander series, which is a spin-off of Deathlands. There was a vintage paperback from Fawcett called Shock Trauma, written by Joe Franklin and Alan DeLaelo. It looks like a great mix of horror and medical stuff, like a medical thriller. It looks really cool. I found an old Ace vintage paperback from Keith Laumer titled Worlds of the Imperium. And if you're keeping track at home, that was Ace M-165, which would have cost you 45 cents in 1962. This was the first book in his Imperium series, which, listen to this, it's got a cool premise. There are 3 books in the series, and they concern parallel worlds that are policed by an agency called Imperium. In the first book, it contains a world where the American Revolutionary War never happened. Kind of reminds me of watching that old Sliders television show where they get into all these alternate universes and histories. Sounds cool. There was another book I found there, which is new to me. It's the debut paperback called Born to Run, which is in a series called Serrated Edge. It's got a painted cover, books from the early 90s. It's on Baen Books, B-A-E-N. Looks to be like maybe a mix of cyberpunk or maybe urban fantasy, sci-fi, something or another. I saw 2 vintage fighting fantasy game book paperbacks with amazing cover art. For you gamers, this was number 5 and 6, both on Dell. A book called The Blitzlight Passage by David Mason on Pyramid Books. Another great painted cover. This one is an espionage thriller concerning the Hindenburg explosion. There's plenty of fantasy, sci-fi paperbacks from authors like Andre Norton. There was an old analog magazine set there. There was a remarkable collection of 100 trade paperbacks called Science Fiction Masterworks. And these books collect vintage sci-fi stories and books, and they had 100 of these. They're distributed in the U.S. by Hachette Book Group, but they originate in England via Orion Publishing Group. I've seen them online, but I've never actually seen one in the wild, much less like a complete shelving system dedicated to them. I thought it was really interesting. I found another vintage series I wasn't aware of called Warbots. This is a Pinnacle series that launched in 1988, and there were 12 books all the way up until 1992. The front looks like a combination of like Terminator and maybe like a Stormtrooper. This paperback is number 5, Operation High Dragon. But I only walked away with 2 paperbacks and spent approximately $1.80. The first paperback I bought is an anthology called 14 Vicious Valentines, and it was published by Avon in 1988. I glanced at the table of contents in the store, saw stories were written by the likes of Talmadge Powell, Nedra Tyer, William Nolan, Bill Kreider, Rick Hodgula. But after last episode, we talked about Simon Ark, created and written by Edward Hoke. I was delighted to see that Edward Hoke is in this collection, and guess what? It's a Simon Ark story. This Simon Ark story is called The Virgins of Valentine. In my brief glance, it shows that Ark and the narrator are in snowy Valentine, Pennsylvania, to stop virgins from being sacrificed at an old cemetery on Friday the 13th on the first day of the full moon on the eve of St. Valentine's Day. Okay, that's weird. It definitely deserves to be part of an anthology called 14 Vicious Valentines. So I'm looking forward to read that story. About maybe, 10, 15 pages. The second paperback I bought led to a domestic dispute. I'm serious. A domestic dispute happened because of a book purchase. So listen, I never, ever see the television tie-in paperbacks for the A-Team. They exist. They were published by Dell in the 1980s during that show's popularity. The A-Team was a men's action-adventure series about mercenaries. However, I don't see the books out very much. So I found one for 50 cents. This is the A-Team number 5, 10% of Trouble. Being that I never see these, being that I love the show, being that you guys need some TV tie-in discussion right here on the show, it was a no-brainer. So I get out to the parking lot with my 2 books, and my wife, who's so patient with me, she never rushes me in the bookstores. She'll shop with me, or she'll just sit down and do stuff on her phone. So she just gingerly asked what I bought. And I show her the A-Team book, and how I never see these out, and how excited I was to find one. She looks at me like I have 2 heads, and she says, "They're everywhere. They're everywhere, honey." And I'm like, "Excuse me?" She says, "We see the A-Team books in the stores all the time." And I counter with, No, we do not." So we get fussy with each other. She says that the A-Team books are immensely popular and that we've seen them before, and I didn't buy them because I told her that they are everywhere. I say that absolutely isn't true, and I say it defiantly. I then figure out what she's talking about. The light bulb went off, and maybe you even know what she's referring to. She's thinking Able Team, not A-Team. Of course, I see them everywhere. That was a long-running series of paperbacks by Gold Eagle in the Mac Bolan universe. Every bookstore I go to seems to have at least one. I get it. She still says that's not the case. She's still saying that we're seeing the A-Team books everywhere. So anyway, there's more development on that later, I believe, but you'll be happy to know that the fuss between 2 middle-aged adults in the parking lot of a used Jacksonville bookstore over men's action-adventure fiction from 40 years ago did not disrupt the evening or our dinner. I'm right, she's wrong, and that's easy to digest. On to more important things like today's feature. That's right, today's feature is parking right here after this short song comes to an end. Depending on who you talk to, Sidney Horler is good, or he's average, or he's just a plain old schmuck. He's got fans and critics lining both sides of the aisle, and he gave them plenty to talk about. He wrote 150 novels, at least, and countless stories and columns. He's known for a variety of spy and crime fiction series titles he created and wrote from the early to mid-20th century. Titles like The Ace, Sir Mark Bellamy, Brett Carstairs, Bunny Chipstead, Sir Brian Fordinghame, Gerald Lissendale, Chief Constable Meatyard, Nighthawk, Sebastian Quinn. It goes on and on and on. He was a busy guy, very prolific, and he also even threw in horror and nonfiction stuff and sports stories. So, let's jump into Sidney Horler. He was born in England in 1888. He was educated at Redcliffe and Colston schools in Bristol. He began professional writing in Fleet Street, first on the Western Daily Press and on Daily Mail, chronicling junior reporting assignments like police courts, inquests, chapel meetings, things like that. He later served in the Air Intelligence in the propaganda section during World War I. After the war, he was hired as a sub-editor for John O. Landon's Weekly before his employment was terminated in 1919. So he became a novelist around 1915, with his first book being a Western titled Standish of the Rangeland. It was published in 1916, but he didn't find success with the Western, and he quickly left that genre way behind. It was during this time that Horler went to the short story market, and he used a pseudonym of J.O. Standish and wrote a serial starring a character named Rex Harley called The Lightning Left. It ran from November 1919 through February 1920 in the pages of The Boy's Realm. I wasn't able to obtain any info on the serial or the character, but I find it interesting that he used the pseudonym of Standish, which was his Western hero in his first book. He'll use that name again with his popular spy series, which we're going to talk about soon. Before the year 1920, Horler had penned an additional 24 short stories for magazines like Short Stories Illustrated, Chums, and the Grand Magazine, all British magazines, I might add. In the novel market, Horler followed Standish of the Rangeland with sports books like Goal, a romance of the English Cup ties, originally published in magazine form first. I think it was News of the World. He also wrote a crime novel called The Breed of the Beverleys in 1921. In a nonfiction book called London's Underworld, there's a newspaper article written by A.E. Wilson from the Star serving as an introduction. In it, Wilson, who was friends with Horler from like this really early age, they were childhood friends, said, quote, "He progressed from boys' fiction to football fiction and from football fiction to the thriller." He also goes on to say, quote, "It was only a few years ago that Edgar Wallace said to me very seriously, 'That fellow Horler is going to be a dangerous rival.'" End quote. Wilson continues and states that if Wallace lived, it would have been interesting to watch the race in output and popularity between the two. Throughout Horler's career, he is often described as being similar to Edgar Wallace. Now, his writing career caught fire in 1925 with the crime novel book called The Mystery of Number One. It was published in the U.S. as The Order of the Octopus and ran in the pages of Top Notch magazine in 1926. It's the first novel in a series that Horler launched starring a British evil genius named Paul Venanti. In The Mystery of Number One, Venanti creates a villain supergroup called The Order of the Octopus, which contains a Chinese man, a Count of Central Europe. There's a woman described as extremely dangerous and desired. Vivanti does all the things that traditional villains do while trying to build a criminal enterprise. So through the course of the series, this British intelligence agent named Peter Foyle, who's also a statesman's nephew, he's there to really nix any of Vivanti's criminal plans. The 6 Vivanti books were published from 1925 through 1945 and included the aforementioned The Mystery of Number One, then Vivanti, the Worst Man in the World, then Vivanti Returns, Lord of Terror, and Virus X, which that one has an amazing cover. It's on Archer Press paperback, but I didn't check who the artist was, but it's amazing. The series gets rave reviews, while others seem to think it's just an average pulpy series of novels with cheap thrills. According to the sources that I researched, the character also appears in at least one of 3 stories published as The Man Who Shook the Earth in 1933, which is an anthology of 3 stories, as I mentioned earlier. He also appeared in another of Horler's short story collections called The Screaming Skull and Other Stories. The series can be described as a mixture of occult and super science. So that's the Vivanti series. Since he had luck in 1925 with a series, he decided to immediately write another series. This one lasted 2 books, False Face in 1926 and Miss Mystery in 1928. Once again, the series stars a villain, a Russian secret agent named Baron Veselovsky, and of course there's a British secret agent as his foe, a guy named Sir Brian Fordingham, who appears in the series debut. There were only 2 books in the series, which is known as the Baron Veselovsky series. However, Horler seemed to like the hero Sir Brian Fordingham, so he spun off this other series, which is 3 books featuring Fordingham. Those books were The Murder Mask, High Stakes, and The Prince of Plunder, which was actually penned in 1913. So the 4-book Brian Fordingham series altogether features those books plus The False Face. So technically this series can be labeled as published between 1913 and 1932. And while we're staying with the theme of series titles, so if we look at the 20s, he's got a character named Bunny Chipstead that debuts in 1927. Chipstead's this freelance British Secret Service agent, which means he can choose which assignments he wants to work, plus he also can work both British and American assignments. There were 4 of these books running from 1927 through 1940. The Chipstead series was In the Dark, Chipstead of the Lone Hand, The Secret Agent, and The Enemy Within the Gates. Next is the Sebastian Quinn series, not to be confused with popular author Seabury Quinn. Now, Sebastian Quinn appeared in 3 stories from 1925 to 1930. He's described as an occult detective. He's an enthusiast of the bizarre, who's devoted his entire life to the study of crime and its most exotic and weird manifestations. He can speak Chinese and he can speak another 17 foreign languages, 14, 17 foreign languages. What's interesting about him is that he isn't necessarily looking to stop a crime. He wants to learn what prompted the outrage to commit the crime. So it's all psychological. His assistant is a man named Martin Huish. So the 3 story appearances exist, but this character was the star of his own 2-book series. The first novel was The Evil Messenger from 1938, followed by Fear Walked Behind in 1942. There's also a short story collection called The House in Greek Street that has a Sebastian Quinn story reprinted from the magazines. As I present this, I'm amazed, and maybe you are too, that all of this stuff isn't just pulp magazines. We aren't talking like short stories or novelettes. These were all novels featuring these characters. I mean, some of the page counts are over 300 pages. If he was a hack, which was popular opinion, he sure was a hard-working hack. And by the way, when I glance at the copyright pages of some of his books, these books were reprinted like 8, 10, 12 times over, so they were selling. We're still in the 1920s, and Horler is cranking out characters and series titles, but still filling the void with standalone sports novels. From my research, I counted 8 sports novels between 1920 to 1926. I mean, between writing crime fiction and adventures and writing about sports, how did he even have time to go to sporting events or even read the paper about sporting events? Continuing in 1926 was another mystery, or I guess you call it a crime fiction novel called House of Secrets, which was all about this mysterious inheritance. This is followed by more standalone mystery novels like The Black Heart, The Fellow Hagen, The 13th Hour, Heart Cut Diamond, Lady of the Night. That finishes out the 1920s, but he also used pseudonyms like Martin Heritage and Peter Cavendish. So just in short stories alone in the 1920s, Horler wrote 137 for magazines and pulps. And there were also recurring characters in some of these stories like a sports team called Sportsman's Club. But switching to a different series, Horler did start one more series in 1928 that was a tremendous success. It launched a small empire for this guy. Harker Bellamy is a British spy master, a Secret Service chief, in an intelligence organization called Q1. This is important because Bellamy runs the place and has agents that directly work for him. He's introduced for the first time in 1928 in a book called The Curse of Doone. Doone is Doone. In this one, Bellamy's on the case of a kidnapped woman by an orphan. The case he assigns to a Q1 agent named Ian Heath, and as Heath is going through the investigation, there's a sense of supernatural stuff happening. Like in many of Holter's novels, there's supernatural stuff that also kind of appears. So when the house that the woman's being held at is rumored to be haunted and apparently may contain a vampire. So Heath has to contend with the mystery plus supernatural hauntings and possibly a bloodsucker. In the third book, Bellamy calls upon one of his agents, a man named Tiger Standish. And as of book 3 of this Bellamy series, it all becomes Tiger Standish through every book, and there were 10 of them. The series ran 1928 to 1948, so you can theoretically take all 11 books and call them the Harker Bellamy series, just like you could possibly take all the Matt Helm books and call them the Mac series, Mac being Helm's boss. However, the Tiger Standish character continues to show up in other books too from 1936 to 1951. Books like Exit the Disguiser, They Thought He Was Dead, The House of Jackals. Tiger Standish does his stuff. He's also in some short stories as well. And I find it strange that the author had a fixture on the name Standish. His first book, if you'll recall, was a cowboy named Standish. Then he used that same name as a pseudonym, and now it becomes the name of his most popular character. It's weird. I don't get it. The Nighthawk series began in 1937, consisted of the books They Called Him Nighthawk, The Return of Nighthawk, Nighthawk Strikes to Kill, Nighthawk Mops Up, Ring Up Nighthawk, Nap on Nighthawk, and Nighthawk Swears Vengeance. Now, this character is named Gerald Frost, and he's a professional burglar. He's described by characters in the books as having the law just unto himself. He robs crooks, and he's taking on cases which the police have been basically just powerless to even touch. So, for example, The Return of Nighthawk has him defending a friend of his, which is a doctor, from a crook named Marius, and who employs like a network of crooks to help him swindle innocent people across London. So the theme of the series is sort of this thief of thieves. However, I did read that sometimes Nighthawk steals from women that he feels are immoral. Also in 1931 was a 2-book series starring Brett Carstairs. He was in The Man Who Walked with Death and The Spy. He's a British secret agent that portrays a wealthy upperclassman to disguise his secret missions against the Soviets. Again, just like the 1920s, Horler is filling in holes between his series installments all through the 1930s. His standalone books in the 1930s add up to 35 to 38 books, in addition to all of these series installments and stories. By this point, Horler has sold over 2 million books. Good Lord, this guy's on fire. Between the years 1925 and 1953, Horler never published fewer than 3 books of fiction in any year. 3 books a year was actually, if you think about it, was really a slow year for him. He only sank to 3 books a year around 1940 due to the Blitz that was happening in England during World War II. Like in 1931, he produced 7 books, and he also did a book of short stories. And in 1951, he wrote 10 novels. And he had been quoted as saying he dictated 25,000 words, which is about 100 pages every single week. As we just talked about, he was a prolific author, and he sold well through the 1920s, the 1930s, and even into the 1940s. His publisher would include Horler for excitement on his books as the marketing slogan. Beginning in 1941, there was an Ace series starring a British secret agent named Justin March, working for an organization named Y.2. And to avoid any confusion, the series is called The Ace. It wasn't published by Ace. There were 3 books total with Enter the Ace in 1941, Hell's Brew in 1952, and The Dark Knight in 1953. Because some of his series installments are separated by so many years, it makes me think that maybe Horler would just come up with a book idea and plot and then think, let me see if I can use this character from way back then to insert right into this current book. I mean, 11 years goes by and he decides to bring back Justin March from a 1941 book and throw him in this 1952 spy adventure novel. I don't know. It's just bizarre. Now that you know the author, I want to talk about the man, and it's wild. So according to his 1934 autobiographical book, London's Underworld, he receives a phone call from the Star newspaper asking him to meet with them. In the meeting, Horler says the question he was asked is if he would undertake a special commission to investigate the underworld of London and how quickly he could start this investigation. They asked if Horler could remove himself from fiction for just a little while, return to his early roots as a newspaper reporter, and do the story for them. Why would they ask Horler of all people? Horler thinks to himself, why ask me? I'm just a mere crime novelist. What would I know about actual crime? What did I, who had written so many novels about high life and low places, know about the underworld? The assignment was to submerge himself into the underworld for a full month, live in it, and describe, for the man and woman to who the word underworld at the present time is merely a vague term thrown around the Sunday sensational news and the cinema. So here's what the Star newspaper told him, quote, "We want you to talk to them and get their viewpoint, describe their habits, their characteristics, their methods of working. In short, to deliver us a clear and composite picture of this section of humanity which we know actually does exist, but of which 99 persons out of every 100 are in complete ignorance. This gentleman," indicating he who had remained nameless, "will act as a guide to begin with, and then after that, it's all up to you." I haven't read this book, but I looked at the chapter list at the beginning, and you can kind of see where the author spent time at. He wined, dined, interviewed, traveled with, and entertained thieves, prostitutes, white slavers, blackmailers, the real Soho, dope traffickers, a crook using the disguise of Santa Claus, and police on the take. In flipping through the book, it's all done in a humorous way, but kudos to him for even doing it if he really did it. And that's the problem. I don't have any way of verifying if this was all just a rube or if it's something that he actually did. If anyone out there knows, please let me know. Horler also wrote screenplays. He wrote 4 screenplays that are listed on IMDb with his name attached to them. I wanted to look at the various reviews out there and the reference materials that examine him as an author, a human, and then the general consensus on his work. First, I checked Bill Pronzini's book titled 1001 Midnights, The Aficionado's Guide to Mystery and Detective Fiction. Pronzini is not a fan. That's being nice about it. In his review of The Curse of Dune, Pronzini says that it is typical Horler, which is inspired nonsense. He goes on to say that the book and Horler's other novels are high camp by today's standards and can be considered for their hilarious prose, pomposity, absurd plots as classics of their type. Pronzini lists 2 insane quotes that Horler said at one point in his career. The first is, quote, "I know I haven't the brains to write a proper detective novel, but there's no class of literature which I feel a deeper personal loathing," end quote. The second quote was, "Of how many women can it truly be said that they are worthy of their underclothes?" End quote. Wow. Another resource I used was a May 1975 issue of The Armchair Detective, and Armchair Detective reviews The Vampire full-length novel and says it is unashamedly in the vein of Dracula. But the reviewer says it's readable enough and that Horler was a lesser Edgar Wallace. On ClassicCrimeFiction.com, there's an excerpt from one of Horler's autobiographical books, and he says, quote, "Like Wallace before me, I have no pretensions to high-flown literary graces. I do not even call myself a novelist. I'm a storyteller, and the people for whom I tell my stories are the masses." End quote. Now, Horler's political views have often come under fire. He's often expressed contempt in his writing of non-British people. Malcolm Turnbull noted that Horler's novels regularly depict Jews as criminals. Horler's book Nighthawk Mops Up has a Jewish villain who collaborates with the Nazis. Really odd. Horler was outspoken and said Americans were absurd, Italians were smelly, the French were dishonest, and the Swiss had wooden faces. Horler also had an ongoing feud, or I guess a squabble, with British crime fiction writer Dorothy L. Sayers, who immensely disliked his work. The same can be said for Scottish writer Compton Mackenzie. Now, Horler suffered a stroke in August of 1954. He then entered Bournemouth Nursing Home and would pass away a few months later on October 27th at age 66. Just to give you an idea how abrasive Horler was, when he died, the Daily Express announced his death by stating, in headlines, "Horler killed every way that there is." So they really want to make sure this guy's dead. I hope you enjoyed that deep dive into the work of author Sidney Horler. He's a weird one. My references for this feature were Fantastic Fiction, Classic Crime Fictions page, Spy Guys and Gals, The World Without End, Archive.org, Armchair Detectives May 1975 issue, and the book Something About the Author, Volume 102 by Alan Hedbland. Oh, and also the book Who's Who in Spy Fiction by Donald McCormick. All right, before I move over to the view, I wanted to share this crazy thing that happened recently involving me and a very successful Hollywood producer. That's right, this actually happened. This is really short. It'll take less than 5 minutes. All right, so to set the table, I've been selling a lot of my paperbacks. I've been selling a lot of them. I recently sold my entire series of The Butcher, which was something like 30 plus books, and then also a box of Executioner book, which was probably like 250 paperbacks. Sometimes when I get into higher prices like that, people will always tell me that they'll pay me, but it'll just take them a couple weeks to get the money. But I had an offer come in to buy both The Butcher and the Executioner boxes. I mean, we're talking like $300 or $400 or something like that. I can't remember how much. I found it unusual that the buyer paid for them immediately, and he also provided an unusual mailing address for the packages to be sent to. He paid shipping for these, and the shipping cost was astronomical. And I believe I had a question, or he did something about the order that I had a question, so I ended up sending him a message through X. And he had replied back, and he said that he read the Paperback Warrior blog, he found the reviews interesting. He asked me what sort of books I would recommend that would make a good film. I asked if he had a big budget or if this was just something he was shooting in the backyard. I have no idea who this guy is. It turns out he's a very successful producer of movies that typically play in the summer almost every year. I've even watched a number of his movies. I'm going to withhold his name because I don't want to, let his private life out or his business for that matter to be spread everywhere. So this is what transpired over the course of a few weeks with this Hollywood producer. I would pitch him a book that I had read that I felt would make for a cool movie. I would send him the title, the author, and then I would send him a 3 to 5 minute audio recording of what I would do to adapt the film successfully. Of course, I encouraged him to read the book, and I sent him at least 10 or 12 of these done in the exact same fashion. Title, author, audio recording of what I would do to make the book come alive on screen. There were 3 books in particular that he found interesting enough to pursue buying on his own. Now, whether he liked them or not, I really don't know. But I will say the authors of those books were Jack Pearl, Clark Howard, and John Lutz. It was a fun little exercise, and it made me feel like a Hollywood writer or an agent. I don't know. Maybe someday I'll be watching one of his movies at the theater, and I'll see a trailer appear for one of the books I pitched. That would be really cool. Anyway, that's my little spill on the Hollywood producer stint that I did. Moving on to today's review. A book called Foul Shot. It was written by Doug Hornig, and it's the first of a 4-book series of private eye novels starring a Vietnam veteran named Lauren Swift. This book, Foul Shot, was published in 1984 and was nominated for an Edgar. So here's the scoop on Private Eye Lauren Swift. He was born and raised in Charlottesville, Virginia. He flunked out of the University of Virginia, UVA, as a freshman and ended up in the American military, serving a stint in the Vietnam War. He's divorced, has an old Volkswagen he calls Clementine, and he's a dedicated UVA basketball fan. He also works as the city's one and only private eye, which unfortunately is a career choice that's kept him living just check to check. The book begins with Swift arriving at this enormous mansion owned and occupied by the Majors family. These people are like filthy rich, like ridiculous. So when Swift arrives, he meets John and Elizabeth Majors, and they pitch this case to him. Their daughter's gone missing from UVA, and they're worried. Swift takes the case for $100 per day, including expenses, which is always the rate in these genre books, it seems like. It's always $100 a day. I don't know if that's just the going rate at that time or what. On the way out of the big old mansion, he's interviewed briefly by the Colonel, which is the girl's grandfather. He tells Swift he doesn't trust Elizabeth, and he wants to have her investigated. Swift politely rejects the offer because he can only do one job at a time. Right now, he just wants to find the girl. The book then flourishes into this captivating thriller with Lauren Swift digging up all these intricate details about the Majors family. And the plot starts to focus on the family's attorney, which is a real sleazeball. This guy is nasty, and what his motivation might be for blackmail. Swift discovers like all these secrets from the Majors family and deep dark secrets that they've been hiding over the course of decades. He's able to connect the blackmail pattern together with some of these secrets that have been withheld. However, there's more than one crime committed here, and that really kind of enhances the story. There's a lot of things going on with crimes and murder, and it's just a wild ride. The domino effect then pushes the narrative into really a frenzied pace for the second half of the book. There's also a touch of romantic chemistry as Swift dates the attorney's secretary. There's also a ton of tense racial hostilities happening in the town over a black man who's considered innocent of any wrongdoing. He's killed in jail, so the city just erupts into rioting. That was 1984, and some things just never seem to change, do they? I've got a fondness for this book due to growing up in Southwest Virginia. We used to drive up to Charlottesville all the time. It was probably like an hour and a half of the interstate to hang out in Charlottesville, eat all their yummy food. It's a gorgeous old southern city. It's got cobblestone streets. It's really cool. So you're probably asking, where's the Foul Shot title even coming from? The book's title represents the inclusion of a character that's paramount to the story, a highly touted UVA basketball player. He brought me some basketball nostalgia here. The rivalries I used to watch as a kid between UVA and North Carolina are highlighted in the book. There's even mentions of North Carolina coach Dean Smith and his ability to always get calls his way. True story, he always did. But beyond the nostalgia, it's just a really entertaining crime fiction private eye novel. I felt like Hornig's inspiration is probably the Spencer character by Robert Parker. And even in the book, Swift is reading a Spencer novel, the fifth Spencer book called The Judas Goat. He's reading that in his bedroom. He's glib, he's sarcastic, he's humorous, he enjoys Irish whiskey. Through first-person narrative, the reader, uncovers the clues in just traditional fashion. The author really throws a curveball in at the end, which was really bold. I really respected that. There's a number of private eye references made, and the book utilizes a number of genre tropes that just keep the pages moving in a good way, at least for me anyway. So Foul Shot scores a smooth page turner. You'll like this book. Now, there's more books. As I mentioned earlier, there's 4 books total. The other 3 books are called Hardball, The Dark Side, Deep Dive, and so apparently there's another book out there, and I can't find any information about it. On encyclopedia.com, they list that Lauren Swift stars in a book called Sidelights from the same author, but I can't find any evidence that Sidelights was ever published. So maybe it was just an outline or something, but I don't see that it was ever published. But Hornig, he also wrote 2 books about a spy named Stephen Kirk. Those books were Waterman in 1987 and Stinger in 1990. And in researching for the review, I also saw that he wrote a book called Virus using a pseudonym of Peter Kane. And for baseball fans, he also wrote a book about the 1975 Boston Red Sox, which again, Boston kind of ties in with the Spencer character, so I don't know. All right, so that's the end of this episode. I hope you enjoyed the feature and the review and the book shopping. We'll be back again, hopefully in 2 weeks with another crazy episode. And you can always follow us on X, follow us on Facebook. Check out our blog, paperbackwarrior.com, where we have new reviews Mondays, Wednesdays, Fridays, and Saturdays. And our Facebook page is often updated at least 5 or 6 times a day. Same thing with X. And as I mentioned earlier, follow us on YouTube because I've got other videos on there besides just the podcast that should be loading soon. Anyway, that's it for today. Thank you for listening and have a great rest of whatever you're doing.